I was in South Carolina for the last 3 weeks with my family, and so I heard a lot of family stories, got some more stories, and I thought I would talk to you about family stories this morning. What are the tales of my tribe, and what are the tales of your tribe? Joan Didion says we tell ourselves stories in order to live, in order to give shape to the shifting phantasmagoria that is our experience. So our experience comes in kind of jumbled, but what we notice and what we hold on to, what we remember, all of those things are shaped by the story structure that we're giving to our noticing, to our lives, the narrative line that we impose on what happens. So some of y'all come from storytelling families and some of you don't. Every family has stories, though. Every church has stories. Every town has stories that it tells about itself. Every nation has stories that it tells about itself. And they let you know what's expected of you. They let you know who you are and where you came from. In my family, this was said out loud, overtly. My Aunt Mabel, when her children would leave on a date, she would say goodbye to them at the door, and she said, "Remember whose you are and whom you serve," which kind of put the kibosh on some lightheartedness. But the stories that you tell, one of the storytellers of note in my mother's side of the family was Uncle Bull, and his real name was Bill. He was a preacher, Uncle Bill. But in the South, if you're loved, you are not called by your actual name. You're called by some other name. So we always called him Uncle Bull, and he would gather a whole group of children at each family reunion where there were maybe 80 grown-ups wandering around. But we always looked for Uncle Bull because there were going to be some good stories coming up. And he always wore a suit and tie. He was an old-style Southern preacher. And he was an elderly man when I remember him. So his voice sounded like this. It was a very preacherly. And he would always wear a tie, even when we were at Bon Clarkin, which was our denomination's summer retreat campground. And when asked what his reasoning was for wearing a tie, he would say, "Well, you never know when you're going to run into a pulpit committee." So we would gather around his feet, and he would tell my favorite one of, other than the time Uncle David's Jeep caught fire and he refused to acknowledge that it was on fire and kept driving, which tells you everything you need to know about my Uncle David. His favorite story was about being at Erskine College, where he had graduated in Due West, South Carolina, and he said, we had a professor of Old Testament who was a very holy man. And now, he would always walk the same path to his classroom every morning, and we decided that we were going to give him a religious experience. So there was a little bush right there by the corner of the building, and we soaked it in gasoline and wired it up. And when he walked by, we set it off. And he said he stood stock still and looking at the burning bush, and like Moses, he took off his shoes, thought he was on holy ground. And that's the end of the story as far as Uncle Bull. Somebody else said they want to know what happened next. I said, I don't know. He didn't tell anything next. That was it. And so I guess I have to make up a better ending for that story. So I was raised on the knowledge that it is important to have a little mischief in your life. We were told that it was important to be smart and productive and to have a good relationship with God and with the church. It was important to give 10% of your money to the church. Stories about aches and pains were not encouraged. Stories about sickness or confusion were not encouraged unless they ended well with help from the Lord. In that case, you could tell that you had been sick, but you weren't allowed to be sick in the present moment. On my father's side, the stories all have to do with how smart you are, what's your IQ, and what books have you written. Not read, written. When I was in college and things would get dull, we'd gather in the hall and people would say, "Meg, tell us about your family." I'd say, "Do you want to hear about my Aunt Ruth, who was Sylvia Plath's psychologist? Or do you want to hear about my other aunt, who was an opera singer, detective, and ended up working for the Sandinistas?" My father felt they had both been duped by the Communist Party. So those 4 kids, my dad and his brother and 2 sisters, were on the radio as prodigies when they were 4 or 5 doing calculus in Philadelphia on the radio. And they were homeschooled by their grandmother. They had these notebooks they said when they were 4, but I think it was more like 7, filled with beautifully written German. They would argue, my aunt, my dad's older sister, and my dad was Donald, and she was Ruth, and Ruth would say, "Oh, Donald, I don't know why you persist in disagreeing with me. You know I'm right. You have always been a little slow. My IQ is 213, and yours is only 212. They were spanked regularly, apparently. My dad didn't believe in spanking because of that. And one time I was punished, not very often, but one time I was punished by being sent to bed without supper. And my father came with me and sat by the bed, crying with me and holding my hand till I fell asleep. Many people's families have stories of adventure, stories of escape, stories of royalty. They talk about the strength and the courage of the ancestors. Some tell about tricky ancestors who were horse thieves. Some tell about spooky, witchy ancestors. Some families talk about being descended from seafarers or pilgrims or landscape designers, authors. They tell stories of running from the slave hunters. They tell stories of running from the Cossacks. They tell stories of 300-mile walks in the winter with a baby on your hip. Families have stories that tell you who you are, who you came from, whether they're your chosen family, whether they're your biological family or your adopted family. You are in a family that tells you stories to let you know about the people amongst whom you have landed. And you know from this who you are and what you're supposed to do and what is expected of you and what is valued in your family. Some families tell you about what you can expect from life. They go on about how you're just surrounded by idiots. Everybody's an idiot in this world. I don't know how people could believe that. They're just a bunch of idiots. Look at those idiots from the Department of Transportation. There's one of them digging and 5 of them looking into the hole. You can't even look at these idiots. I'm surrounded by these idiots driving around. They don't know how to drive. You got to merge onto a highway. There's a bunch of idiots, and so the children are listening to the stories about who you're surrounded by. Some families tell stories about being surrounded by people that need to be tricked and lied to and fooled because that's the only way you stay safe. Other people tell stories about, my dear friend Pat said his mother would always say, "Now remember, we are not better than anyone else." And one day he said to her, "Mama, but we are better than people who think they're better than other people, aren't we?" my younger son learned critical thinking from one of our neighbors because she was isolated in her own reality, which is the way that we say crazy now. She would tell stories about being abducted by aliens and miraculous escapes from one thing or another. And so he and I would discuss and learn critical thinking by examining the stories that Miss Deborah told. But Miss Deborah's stories always ended in this one particular way. And she would say, one time my granddaddy's leg, it got hurt real bad, and we couldn't take him to the doctor, so we had to fix it ourselves. And we set him up in a bucket of ice, and I'm not going to go into the rest of it. And then we got him to the hospital finally the next day, and the doctor said that if we had done that surgery 10 minutes later, he'd have died. One time I was working at Hardee's, which is a fast food place. I was working at Hardee's and it got robbed. And the robbers, they took me out in the parking lot and they was keeping me captive. And I just kept talking. I just kept talking to remind them that I was a real human being. And I said, this is what my birthday is and what's your birthday? And this is my name. And this is my mama's name, but she's not really my mom. She's my mama that raised me. And she said, and finally the police came and they said if I hadn't have kept them talking, I'd have died. And one time I was abducted by aliens, and they took me to their leader, and he thought I was real beautiful, and he said, if you give me a kiss, I'll let you go home, and so I did, and let me go home. Well, I don't know what would have happened if she hadn't kissed him. She probably had died. Every religion is a tapestry of stories. My Aunt Mabel used to read us from the Bible story book at breakfast every single morning. We heard, and it was an old-fashioned Grimm's Bible story book with a lot of bloody stories. I remember teaching the religious education instructors at my South Carolina church. I went through the whole Old Testament, and kind of the Old Testament in an hour, and I was telling the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Rebekah and Rachel and Jacob. And one of them raised her hand after the story, I think, of Abraham almost sacrificing Isaac. And she's like, excuse me, you want us to tell these stories to the children? But yeah, we loved them. We loved the story of Absalom, who was a son of David. He had beautiful, magnificent hair. And he had just participated in a coup against his father, and he was running away in a chariot, and a low-hanging branch grabbed him by the hair. And the soldiers pursuing him found him there, just kind of hanging in the tree, unable to get free because the tree had snagged his hair. We liked that one, and we love the story of the death of Jezebel, because, you know, Jezebel, you can't even say her name without saying Jezebel. She died by falling out of a tower, and we like this part. Close her eyes. And the dogs ate her, all but the palms of her hands. We were just like, ugh. So the Bible was our true blood. But the main shaping story for the Judeo-Christian culture in which we live and move and have our being, most of us, is the Exodus story, where you're enslaved in Egypt, and then you get free only to wander for a while. And then finally, after many trials, you find the promised land. This is the archetypal shaping story for our culture. And you understand this when you see that even infomercials have this same shape. So, you go, my hair was dry and brittle. I could not do a thing with it. I tried many products. I tried natural products, eggs, mayonnaise, beer, nothing. I tried every shampoo, expensive, cheap, nothing. Finally, I found whatever. And now I'm in the promised land and my hair is silky and lovely and everything's good. Or, I was bad, addicted to drugs. And it was getting the best of me. And I thought something has to change. So I finally went to whatever group it is, and it was hard for a while, but now I'm clean, and I will be forever. I weighed 750 pounds. I tried everything. I tried this diet and that diet. I tried getting my stomach stapled. It didn't work. I tried everything, and but now I've tried whatever this is, and I weigh 100 pounds. So you're enslaved, you wander, then the promised land. But a more realistic story for all those things is, I was bad addicted to drugs. I thought, this is it. I'm getting off the drugs. I tried for a little while. I put together 20 days of sobriety. Then I had a slip. And then I was on drugs again for a while. I tried again to get off. I did. Put together 2 years. But then, had another slip. And now, it's just a struggle. It's a disease. So we just struggle with it, and we're doing our best. Is that satisfying? No. Is it realistic? Yes. Nobody wants to say, yeah, I've lost weight. I've lost 20 pounds 500 times. How much weight is that? Yeah. That's not a satisfying story to anybody. It has to be slavery, wandering, promised land. You can tell when you're violating your culture's expectations, stories, when you change it up a little bit. Like you get a parking space, and you say to the people in the car, wow, that's just my luck. And they're like, what? Because mostly people say, well, that's just my luck when you have bad luck. But if you're presenting yourself as a lucky person, if you tell yourself a story about your life that you're lucky, then it's just your luck for things to go well. In the Northeast, when people say, how you doing? You're supposed to say, busy. Sometimes they don't even wait for you to answer. They'll go, how you doing? Busy? And so every now and then I like to change it up, and people go, hey, Meg, how are you doing? Busy? And I'm like, no, not too bad. People kind of don't know what to say because that's not the story of your culture. The story of the Northeastern culture is that you better be busy or you might as well be dead. So I read an article in the New Yorker magazine years ago. Moving to New Jersey from South Carolina was funny, just as an aside, because one person said, oh, Meg, you might want to start reading the New Yorker magazine. It's quite good. I was like, yeah, we had that in South Carolina too. Anyway, years ago, with millions of other South Carolinians, I read an article in the New Yorker magazine about a woman who was a horse trainer. She was one of the gentle horse whisperer kind of trainers. And she talked about the stories that a horse tells itself about itself. This was a revelation to me. I was working as a therapist at the time, and I thought, of course, you tell yourself a story about yourself. And she would say, I don't train the horse, I just become aware of the story that it's telling itself about itself, and then we work together on changing the story. Wow. So I thought, it's important for people to become aware of the stories that they are telling themselves about themselves. It's important for churches to learn what stories they are telling themselves about themselves. How does this affect you? If you tell yourself the story that you're an unlucky person, then the things that you notice in your life are the times when things don't work out well. If you tell yourself the story that you're a lucky person, then you notice completely different things. If you tell yourself you're bad at relationships, you're going to comport yourself in a certain way. If you tell yourself that you look stupid when you dance, you're going to comport yourself in a certain way. Just become aware. All I'm asking you is to become aware of the stories that you're telling yourself, because they shape your experience, and your children are listening. The children around you are listening to the stories, so they'll know what kind of world they're living in. Stephen Sondheim wrote a wonderful show called Into the Woods. And there is a song that says, "Be careful the tales you tell. Your tale is your spell, and the children are listening. So be careful the tales you tell. Tell yourself truer stories. The children are listening, and your story is sacred. It is as sacred as the story of Moses and Aaron, as sacred as the story of Rebecca. It's as sacred as any story out there, the story of your life.